Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our Hemp podcast series. This is Transition Town Media's Hemp Study Group that got a grant from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture to bring some awareness to all things hemp. So here we are. We're here today to talk about some hemp-derived cannabanoids, and we have a special guest with us here. Her name is Andrea Sparr-Jaswa. She's from Thomas and Jefferson University, and I believe you're a master's in public health, yes, correct?
That is correct.
So welcome, Andrea. We're here today to talk about some of the stuff you may see out on the table. We'll be pointing to it every once in a while. I'm going to let you take over, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Andrea Sparr-Jaswa. I got into this industry a number of years back. I moved out to Oregon and kind of immersed myself in the industry, became the director of education for the first science-focused dispensary in the country, was later the science editor for Cannabis Business Times, Cannabis Dispensary, and Hemp Grower magazines. We had a project launching before the pandemic that ultimately got canceled, so I moved myself over to Philadelphia to pursue a master's of public health, specifically focused on drug policy as it pertains to the cannabis industry. That's why I'm here.
Welcome to the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection. I hope you're
you.
experiencing that so far here in Philadelphia.
Very much so.
So we're really, really happy to have you with us. And, it's really interesting to hear that you kind of just went out to Oregon to jump in. That's just something that's always been on my mind. One of these times I'm going to get in the car and just jump in somewhere. We're waiting here in Pennsylvania, and it's been a long, time for a lot of us who, have been using these products for a long time. And, we've had adult use cannabis here for a while. And, you can go into any store nowadays and you see all this stuff. And I just feel like we're missing out on the education. We've bombarded this world with all these products and stuff. And nobody really knows what they're doing with them, honestly. I know I go in, all right, let's try this. And that's not the way to go about it. I can tell you that right now. But, there really isn't a whole lot out there. So I'm hoping that, you can shed some light on what, say, Delta 8 versus Delta 9 is. So what is Delta 8?
Delta 8 is a compound that is found naturally in cannabis, specifically related to hemp. But it's generally in really low quantities, so it's very difficult to source directly from the plant for any sort of large-scale production. So what most manufacturers are doing is synthesizing it from CBD through a chemical process in which then they're left with large quantities of Delta 8 as well as other small amounts of other cannabinoids and possibly contaminants as well, something that we can discuss. But it is generally considered sort of THC, Delta 9 THC light. Most people find it to be intoxicating. It engages with the same CB1 receptors that THC does. So you have a lot of the same sort of effects that you see with Delta 9.
As you can see, my cat is a fan of hemp, and Deuce is up here to say hello. We're going to let him go.
So Delta 8 engages with the same CB1 receptors as Delta 9. It's a mildly euphoric isomer of Delta 9. There's only like a double carbon bond that has a slightly different placement in the molecule. So some of the reported benefits could possibly be, if in regard to the CB1 receptor, would be antiemetic, so anti-nausea, anti-vomiting, anxiolytic, anti-anxiety, dose-dependent, of course, all of this. Appetite, increasing appetite, and pain relief. It began as a sort of way for hemp producers who had a glut of production to participate in the market, which is why, they came up with creative solutions to be able to participate in a, intoxicant market. But yeah.
So what you're saying is, what I heard is Delta 8 is weed light, yes, in a way, and has a lot of the same feelings are produced as, your traditional THC Delta 9. But we do know a lot less about what this does over time.
Right.
So, always caution, 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 caution. And,
Sure.
this is, it's a new market, these are new things. So, you certainly want to be cautious. And, you talked about dose dependent. So, we always want to do slow and low, always start low. So, I think that's important, both for Delta 8, Delta 9, and whatever would be next. And, the next one I would like to talk about is maybe THCP. I heard this stuff is like 30 times more potent than, so this says D9 plus THCP, high potency gummy.
Yes.
So what's this all about?
THCP was first reported right around like end of 2019, found in small quantities, again, in hemp, happened to be in hemp, any sort of cannabis, small quantities. It is reportedly 30 times more potent at, I believe, CB1 receptors. So again, that is the receptor that is associated with intoxication and all of those euphoric effects that THC produces. It, again, is, not produced in high quantities. So again, it has to be synthesized in a lab in order to produce it at any sort of scale. So that's always a concern.
Give me an idea. I think there was like 10 gummies in here. How much hemp would need to be produced in order to make 10 gummies?
I mean, if it's being synthesized, I'm not a chemist. I don't, know how people are creating it specifically. But once you have, most of these things are being sourced from CBD or Delta 8 and then translated into something else. So like CBD into Delta 8 into
metamorphosis.
It's mostly being synthesized from CBD. I'm not entirely certain on THCP and how it's being synthesized. But generally speaking, you really only need a small quantity of the original compound in order to ultimately produce large quantities of the result product. But also CBD can be found in high quantities in hemp. So I don't know. I don't know about the specifics of that. Okay. Sorry.
It's just interesting. This is CBD flower. It's a bunch of stalks and leaves and stuff. And what would they do with this? How do they make this into, like, any idea how they, would take a raw material like that, and how much raw material is needed? Like, I know you really said you didn't know.
I really don't know. I don't know. I've never worked within a processing facility, and I don't know the specifics of like quantities needed in order to produce the overall byproducts that are being produced.
I think maybe that's a scary thing. We just don't know. There's just not a
whole lot of transparency.
Yeah, there's not a lot of.
Nobody's regulating. Nobody's there's no oversight to any of this. So what is being produced is, you have to rely on whether or not the company you believe is trustworthy. And even then, because of the way that a lot of these things are produced, there are contaminant byproducts that aren't necessarily being measured. That aren't being measured in part because chemists don't even know what they are yet. So there are a lot of spikes on the chromatography that nobody can identify. And we don't know the health risk profile of any of those things, in addition to the fact that the process itself can create contamination if it's not properly distilled. And again, there's no oversight. So, we don't know what a lot of these products, what else is in these products. We do know from plenty of research, both industry side and academia side, that, the vast majority of these products do contain much higher levels of Delta 9 THC than is legally allowed from a hemp source product. And that very few of the products that are being put out onto the market are accurately labeled in terms of even their Delta 8 content. Either it's over or under what is being labeled on the product itself.
So it seems like there's a whole new budding industry out there, so to say, that it's going to be a whole network of things. It's going to take a whole bunch of different, infrastructures and things like that that are going to have to be put in place in order for us to, confidently say that this is safe or it's not safe. It's no one has ever died from cannabis from what I heard. But I have heard stories of people dying from vaping or dying from something else. There was even a story about, you had mentioned contaminants, about some CBD gummies that were laced with fentanyl. How does that happen? And like, is that
Well,
something we really need
I
to be
mean,
worried about?
first off, that story was false. That was not, in fact, the case. And the Inquirer, which first released that article, did retract. So no fentanyl in gummies to anyone's knowledge as of yet. No real use for that. I mean, there's no real purpose for that. There's no reason for the market to produce that. So it's not a huge concern. I would say the bigger concern is that, especially with any sort of acetate, like THCO or Delta 8 like O, as an acetate, similarly to vitamin E acetate, it can cause lung injury. And there's we're beginning to see some evidence for, lung risk associated with any sort of acetate product. So anything that is labeled as an acetate, or even if it's not labeled as an acetate, but it is being synthetically derived, there's a very good likelihood that it possibly could have those same sort of compounds present. And I would certainly caution wholeheartedly against vaping anything that is sourced from a hemp-derived product. I think that is one of the biggest concerns. We have little to zero research on what that means for ingestibles like gummies, although, certainly people who have ingested, we'll just talk about Delta 8 because it's the most ubiquitous. People who've ingested Delta 8 you've seen, maybe slightly higher rates of emergency room utilization, adverse events, in part because maybe not even necessarily because of the Delta 8, but because of other byproducts that are available in there, or again, unmeasured THC doses, Delta 9 THC, or improper labeling of Delta 8, in which case somebody might be over consuming for what they think that they're getting. Not to mention some of these products, all of these products are sold again in an unregulated market, so packaging is going to look more appealing to kids. Anything that's left out, it's certainly a consideration. So yeah, the acetate component is definitely of concern, particularly when it comes to implications for the lungs.
I have heard that. So recently, I believe I saw an article that THCO, which I purchased legally, maybe a month or so ago, is no longer legal because it doesn't fit the criteria as it's stated under the 2018 hemp or farm bill,
right,
for hemp. And it because of the synthetic nature, because it can't be naturally derived in any kind of way without adding that acetate, they have put it on the controlled substances schedule. So it's no longer considered a hemp product. And, I want to make a note because, I tried this stuff, THCO, and, people told me it was going to do this and that. And I did a lot of research on it. And I will tell you that it was probably the most psychedelic cannabis experience I've ever had. I think a lot of it, I had that assumption going in. I did a lot of reading and things like that. Apparently, they used this stuff as a weapon of war back in the 1940s. I don't know if that's propaganda or not. But
I've not heard that, but
that's what they said. So it was interesting. It was very psychedelic. I could to visualize it, I could see my brain, and there were different firings of different neurons and things like that. So that's just my little testimonial story about that. I don't know if I'll ever do it again. I probably took more than the recommended dose, which is not good either. But it was dramatically different than me smoking a joint, which is something, I've used cannabis in many different ways, for a long time. And that one definitely hit me more so than any Delta 8 or HHC or THCP. So, I wanted to note that, so again, that's one that I certainly, would be careful with. And the fact that it's illegal now, probably there's a lot more research that needs to be done on this, especially smoking it. So right. That was like the biggest danger is, originally the stuff was marketed in like, pens or dabs and stuff, and you light the stuff on fire, it gets mixed with the vitamin E, and the same thing's happening that was happening with the vape pens is happening with that. So I'm glad nobody had to get hurt or anything before we made some of those decisions, I guess.
Yeah. The DEA has definitely clarified that anything that is not completely naturally sourced from hemp is not considered legal under the Farm Bill. So when you start to consider synthetics and derivatives that aren't naturally sourced, it is, you're going to still see it on the market. There's no oversight, right? They can say that all they want, but nobody's going into the shops and taking it off of the shelves. There's just not that kind of power behind it yet. That being said, I think it speaks to the need for regulation on hemp, not only for the derivatives that are being produced that produce intoxication, but also, for CBD products as well. Again, there's no oversight or regulation for the most part, with some state to state disparities, like Oregon, for instance. Any sort of consumable CBD product that has to be adhere to the same sort of labeling and testing requirements as cannabis sourced hemp or marijuana sourced hemp, or marijuana sourced CBD. Sorry. So it speaks to a need at the federal level. Certainly, we've created with the Farm Bill, we've created a market for these products, but without any sort of regulatory oversight, and it really limits the ability for consumers to make informed choices in the products that they are using for very real needs, and should be able to continue to use that safely and with proper testing and labeling.
Awesome. So the regulatory concerns, I think they are absolutely legitimate. One of the things I think we need to at least be careful with is for 80 to 100 years now we have regulated this plant, and so I don't know if more so I think we need to find a balance, and I know that Pennsylvania hasn't really come up with their system yet, so we've got some time to really look at other models and different things, and figure out a way we can do it differently here, or we can do it so that it helps the most. We don't want to overregulate to the point where we're making more criminals. We don't want to overregulate to the point where we can't have small businesses, and so that regulation thing I think we're going to get back to in a minute.
Yeah.
But I really want to talk about beverages.
Sure.
So if you look over here, there's different beverages. There's Delta 8, there's Delta 9 beverages, and there's also something called HHC, hexahydrocannabinol.
Hexahydrocannabinol.
So I don't drink, and every time I go into a bar now, I ask for a CBD drink, and nobody's ever got it.
Yeah.
But all this stuff you can find it everywhere. Like I find it all the time, and I want to be able to have this stuff out at the bar. Can you tell us a little bit about what this is? One of the big words is nano-emulsification, and basically what they told me is really, really small particles, and by doing that, it kind of helps the onset time. So when you smoke a joint, it's like almost immediate, but if you eat a brownie, it can be like 2 hours. So the beverages seem to hit, like in a 10-15 minute range, but they tell me that's because of nano-emulsification. So I really see a market for this beverage thing just from a social aspect, from, part of my issue with, the medical marijuana program is we give these cards and we tell people, don't let anybody see you, smell you, touch you, close your windows, and a lot of them are given for anxiety. That's so counterintuitive. We need to give people outlets. We need to give people social situations where they can utilize the medication and learn to be more social and learn to do different things and learn to, whatever therapeutic value you're chasing on this drug, we have to be able to give people outlets and environments to do that. I think the beverage industry is certainly something that, I see this being something that can be really helpful. But, my concern is, what are some of the risks? So can you tell me about the risks of said beverage industry?
I mean, again, it really comes down to unregulated products with zero oversight. I think, once we have proper testing and labeling of those products, absolutely. I think, there are plenty of options, around the country that have created safe spaces for hemp sourced consumption, and even incorporated them into certain markets, probably incorporated them into, drinking places where you can drink alcohol as well. I mean, there is a growing movement of people who want to consume less alcohol and have taken up cannabis and hemp sourced products as an alternative. I think safe consumption spaces across the board from a drug policy standpoint is ideal. We have bars on every corner. We should also have safe spaces for cannabis and for other drugs as well. I mean, we need to make sure that people are having, experiences that they can imbibe safely and, in social settings, and create environments that really enhance the efficacy of the benefits of the products themselves.
I think there's a vibe too. I don't know if the bar is necessarily the same crowd all the time. It's not saying one's, but I'd rather be not a bar, in a room with some couches and some chill music and, so this idea of being able to create these spaces that will, give us a nice environment to be able to therapeutically enjoy and really tap into the true therapeutic value of this. Because I think by telling people that, yes, this is legal, but don't let anybody smell you, it's still inherently in us. We're doing something wrong.
Right. There's still stigmatization.
And there's just no way to capture or optimize the therapeutics when we're basing it from a basis of it's wrong. Yeah. It's the amygdala talking, right?
We know that cannabis in general as a naturally sourced product is safer than alcohol on a variety of different levels. And we should be encouraging people to make that switch and reduce their alcohol consumption. I think overall we would see a lot of public health benefits if more people used cannabis as their preferred intoxicant than alcohol.
Word. All right. So Liquor Control Board, the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board, I have heard that there's a push for the LCB to start regulating adult use cannabis in Pennsylvania. So what's that all about? And is that really the way we want to go? I mean,
that's a good question, and one that I don't know if I'm fully prepared to answer. I will say that the precedent is pretty strong for liquor control boards to sort of, regulate industries across the different states. That's pretty standardized at this point. The biggest topic of interest, I think, is that a couple of legislators here in Pennsylvania have considered introducing legislation that ultimately would create a state-run retail environment, very similar to the state-run retail environment of alcohol. I think that there are pros and cons to that, certainly. However, there's not a lot of precedent for it. So right now you have that model to some degree in Canada, where you have state-run or provincial-run dispensaries in addition to small business licenses as well, which ultimately can mean more money in the state's pocket that ultimately can benefit the people. Especially if we make sure that money is set aside for social equity grants and reparation grants, and also I would say mental health, because we have in Oregon, after Oregon Measure 110, you have decriminalization across the state, but they didn't have an infrastructure set up to handle a mental health infrastructure to set up to handle that sort of the need that was going to happen. And I think if we want to start preparing for moving forward with decriminalization as a broad category, which does seem to be something that is being talked about more and more and more, then we need to make sure that there's a mental health infrastructure set up in place. Additionally, in state-run alcohol models, consumption levels of alcohol tend to be a little bit lower. So there is benefit to that. That being said, it could potentially push consumers into other markets around Pennsylvania. based on depending on what product is available and depending on how those places are regulated. I would say I'm certainly open to the discussion of a partial state-run model, but I think we need to carve out a substantial portion of licenses for small businesses so that people can ultimately, create the mom and pop shops that this industry, the grassroots component of this industry was built upon. And also, have beautiful craft grown cannabis in small batches and all sorts of fun things that we see in other like West Coast markets.
I think the idea of the craft market, and people get, therapeutic value out of just the growing of it, and, creating the medicines.
Gardening
and,
is very therapeutic.
creating the proper cannabinoid profile for their particular, this craft growing, I think, starts to become more of a conversation of, home grow, and, how many plants can we grow ourselves? Sure. And, I believe that that's really, a better way to look at some of this, and give people the opportunity to grow their own medicine, give them the opportunity to not have to pay really high prices, for stuff that doesn't really cost anything. We're going to kind of put ourselves back into a situation that, here we have with pharmaceuticals, and a lot of our disposable dollars are going to these medicines. Well, right. I don't want to create another, situation like that,
Yeah.
So the idea of home grow, I think, is very important, and the ability to have, certain plants in veg state and certain plants in bloom state, so that you can have the proper mix and the proper strains. Because I know I use cannabis, more than the regular person, and I have more experience. But, I enjoy the ability to have different strains for different things. And, if I had a crop of, 4 plants and it's just 4 strains and I had to deal with them for a year, that may not necessarily be the best solution for me. Mm-hmm. I like to have the variety. I feel that, by not building the tolerances and things like that, I can get the beneficial effects of each particular profile.
Sure.
And I don't know if any of that's right. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I don't go to school for this. I've just lived my life, and, I have testimonial experience, and, unfortunately, most of what's out there is that, because for so long we weren't allowed. We weren't allowed to even study it because of the schedule that it was on. It could only be studied for its addictive properties, and, it really took us back, quite some time. And the more I learn about hemp, and not just cannabis as a medicine, but hemp as an industrial resource, and how important this thing is for the environment, and the carbon sequestration, and the this and that, and like all of these different things, they're starting to add up. And apparently for 10,000 or more years, they were doing it that way.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the line, somebody had a better idea.
Hemp has an enormous is an enormous component of our historical economy. Here in Pennsylvania, it was a cash crop that people were, honestly, in the colonies were told they had to grow, in part, specifically for the fiber, for shipping industries. But, there's also like the 1914 $10 bill that has an image of a hemp field, on the back of it, that was originally drawn by a woman here in Pennsylvania. Like, Pennsylvania has a strong history of hemp production, and I would love to see that return. I think that, hemp farmers have been left out of the conversation, in part, in terms of the legal medical cannabis market. They've been left out of the conversation because right now, as it stands, hemp producers, or rather cannabis licensees, can source hemp biomass at scale to then take into their processing facilities and be used in their products, but there is no direct market access for hemp farmers. So right now there's this, there are middle people that are keeping them from the ultimate profits that they could be having. In addition to the fact that by not allowing those hemp products into direct market access and direct consumer access, you are not encouraging hemp producers who are then, creating tinctures or vape pens or whatever to get their products tested and labeled accurately. So again, then you see products being sold onto the market that aren't there's no regulation or oversight to, and consumers can't be sure of the exact amount of cannabinoids that they're receiving in those products. And again, there are plenty of studies that have looked at hemp sourced CBD rich products, bought at gas stations, bought online, bought at supermarkets, that again very rarely hit the cannabinoid level that is promised on the profile, and again sometimes have over the legal THC allowed amounts in the products, which can ultimately cause adverse reactions in people who aren't expecting it. So I think, bringing the hemp producers into the legal market in a fair exchange, because we want to make sure that they don't have to pay the same prices that people who are producing intoxicating cannabinoids are subject to, would really ultimately help public health in general, and also put Pennsylvania ahead in terms of a reliable source for CBD source products.
Thank you. So it sounds like there really could be a nice market for this here in Pennsylvania because of, the agricultural areas that we have. We also have, industrial centers here in the state, and we also have a lot of people, and, there's probably been a good market here for a long time. So, I think it's really important that we figure out how to do this right, so that, I think the greatest failure could be, a bunch, like 5 or 6 different industries grabbing all the money. And, this is a plant that can be healing for all of us in many, many ways. And I think the economic healing and some of the social equities and social justice values of this, they can't be overlooked. They need to be celebrated at this point. I mean, I really would just like somebody to stand up and say, you know what, this is what we're going to do. Why? Because we screwed up. And this is how we're going to fix it. That's probably why they'll never elect me. But, all that being said, I know that you spend a lot of time, making some notes and everything, and I want to give you some opportunity if there's anything that we haven't really discussed that you really want to bring to light. I'll give you a few minutes now, and then we'll probably wrap it up real shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just to kind of jump back to grow your own, I think that is, it has to be explicit in the in every single legislation, and we need to make sure that grow your own is incorporated into every single legislation. It's going to give people access to the products that they most desire. It's going to give them access to natural products, because when we talk about cannabis as being a natural product, none of these things on this table here, with one exception, are truly natural. So when we're talking about cannabis as natural and safe, fairly benign compared to other intoxicants, at least, right? We need to be sort of differentiating between cannabis and cannabinoid products. I think that needs to be a distinction. But also we need to make sure that people have access to grow at home, in part to give them the access that they need to the products that they desire, but also because it will help to push the market in better directions. It adds competition, right? And it makes sure that large players are beholden to the needs of the consumer, where they're not right now. Right now, you have a dearth of CBD-rich products on the market, and I have patients who, are solely reliant on CBD-rich products and can't find it week to week or month to month. I have told the story 1,000 times, but I had a client who ultimately had to choose between their religion and their medicine, because the only CBD-rich products that were available to them were encased in gelatin, and they practiced halal. So we need to make sure that there is a wider variety of products. And right now, the handful of multi-state operators that are operating in the state of Pennsylvania, because they have complete control right now, are not responsive to the needs of the consumers. And so again, having grow your own access that includes a reasonable amount of plants available to the patient or the consumer, is a necessity in the market. I do want to mention there is an attorney named Shalene Title who runs the Parabola Center. It's a nonprofit organization, was involved in the Massachusetts market, in the Regulatory Control Board in the Massachusetts market, and is a distinguished professor at the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University, who has laid out 8 points for reducing monopolies that ultimately impact public health and social equity availability. For even these states that put social equity into the legislation, if there are ways that multi-state operators who have billions of dollars at their disposal can ultimately still control the market, and the East Coast is a prime example of that. So I just want to mention these 8 points that she laid out in an article that she wrote for the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at the Moritz College of Law. So number 1, allow home grow, 100%, reasonable amounts of personal plants. Number 2, prohibit vertical integration. Number 3, there shouldn't be a cap on total business licenses available in the state, because ultimately if there are those large entities can gobble them all up and keep everybody else out of the market. But you can limit a market share of any one person or one entity so that more people can be involved, increasing true small business competition. Number 4, create incentives for states to license small or disadvantaged businesses. Certainly a lot of states have put that into their legislation, but in practice it is not held up. New York is trying really hard, but they have a lot to overcome. Number 5, enforce ownership limits and review mergers on existing evidence of predatory or anti-competitive tactics. Number 6, disqualification for any sort of corporations who have engaged in crimes, defrauded the public, or created any sort of substantial public health damage. Right now, there are people who are kept out of the market because they have a previous cannabis conviction. Those are not the people that should be kept out of the market. They're the people that should be at the front of the market. And it is the companies that have kept them out of the market and have continued to fight legislators to make sure that they retain control that should be held accountable. We've seen this with Curaleaf recently, and it should be, something that is at the forefront of every up and coming legislation. Number 7, create a multi-agency task force on anti-monopoly limits. We have the laws there are antitrust laws that exist. We need to enforce them. And number 8, authorize states to ban or delay interstate commerce in order to preserve state level advantages to local businesses. Right now, we don't have interstate commerce, but it's certainly being discussed. You have while this is generally a term that I associate with other things, a trigger law in the Pacific Northwest that would allow for interstate commerce to essentially start up the moment that federal laws allow it to do so. However, we need to make sure, each state is so disparate in the way that it has sort of created their individual markets. And you have a lot of markets where large companies have sort of invested heavily. We need to make sure that the profits are kept here in Pennsylvania. In anticipation of interstate commerce.
Well, thank you. That's certainly a long list of things to do, but the idea of we've got a bunch of people sitting in jail who know how to run the cannabis business better than anybody else out there. The fact of the matter is, why aren't they doing it? I'm going to end it on that, and that's really what I'm going to really think is important out of a lot of this conversation. So, Andrea, thank you very much. I really appreciate all your time, all your expertise. I hope you all learned a little bit today. We will be back for future episodes, but for now, hemp hooray.